Good morning, everyone. My name's Darren Stolzenberg. I'm a partner in the CMS Funds Group in London, and I'm the chair of the AREF Education and Training Committee. AREF, as you're aware, likes to pride itself on being the voice of the real estate funds industry. And in the last couple of years, in particular, I think, have really tried to reinvigorate the association, really trying to encourage participation by a broader group of people. So that's why we've started the Education and Training Committee. We were originally given a remit which said we weren't to be a training machine, for want of a better word. It was more about information and dissemination in the broader sense. But as part of that, we have decided to have quarterly briefings, which we've titled our FORT series, which really is Funds, Operations, Regulation and Tax. Pretty broad, anything to do with the funds industry itself. We've obviously had events over the last couple of years looking at disruptors in the industry, obviously around pricing in open-ended funds, and also around the recent capital gains tax changes with the non-residents. And so coupled with that, Brexit, political uncertainty, we thought maybe it was also potentially a good time to start looking at what have people been doing with funds in the past, what are the structures they're looking at in the future. So I'd like to thank Citco, who have basically sponsored our FORT series, Cass for hosting today, and Rachel Portlock, who's been instrumental in undertaking the interviews, doing the research, and pulling the report together. One of the things I'd just like to mention, basically, is the Future Gen Committee. So as I said, we're all about growing the group, encouraging younger people to get involved, and we have set up a Future Gen Committee as well. So I'd encourage you all within your organisations to basically spread the word of AREF, tell the younger guys and ask them to get involved and look out for events that AREF are basically hosting, and also basically link up to, I think it's LinkedIn and various other mailing lists so they can get information. The other thing is we're only as good as what you guys want. So it's really useful at the end if you can complete the suggestion cards, give us ratings, email in, whatever it may be, just so we have feedback, so we're giving you what you guys want. I think on that basis, I'll hand over to Alex, who's from Cass, to sort of moderate and take us through the session.
Thank you very much, Darren, and welcome to everybody. So for some of you, it might be the first time you've come to Cass, and clearly your overriding impression will be, my word, they've got an effective fire alarm system. So apologies for that this morning. In the event, in terms of housekeeping, that it does go off again. It was a false alarm, by the way. The building is not burning down. And the fire warden, I'm told, is here and should be coming through. So it was very interesting seeing some of you come through this door. For some of you, it's clearly the first time in a few years that you've been back at a university-based environment. Some people had a look of happiness upon their face, others less so. But this is the Real Estate Research Centre here at Cass, and I just wanted to spend 2 seconds explaining what it was. This building here is where we house the MBA and Executive Education programme, which is why you may notice it's a little bit more grown up. There's the main site, which is at Bunhill Row, and there's the undergraduate site at Northampton Square. So this is where I run the research centre from. We launched it at the back end of last year, and really the purpose is to provide a bridge between the academic community and practitioners. And the first thing I'd like to say is it's not just the real estate practitioners. Within Cass we have a very active body. We have an M&A centre, we have a centre for digital leadership, we have a marketing and strategy department, etc. So in the way that the property world is evolving, and we were chatting with John earlier, it's very much a question of engaging with academics and best practice across all the disciplines, not just real estate. But the main objective of the Real Estate Research Centre is really to produce reports on interesting topics, and that's why we haven't done anything on Brexit, on interesting topics that we see going forward, and host events such as this, which is really partly educational and partly topical. And also we have a fundamental rationale for producing academic papers, so we have to do that, but really disseminating that to the wider community, and that's the key point. So it's that bridge. And what we do here is offer executive education. One of the key things that we've noticed is it's no longer the case that people finish their degree, then possibly their masters, and then that's it. It is now very much a question of lifelong learning and adapting, and we see a big demand, and we've had several companies come to see us in the last few months about executive education programs. To give you a flavour, a couple of Chinese companies came over and wanted a one-day session about the real estate market in London post-Brexit. We've had a couple of fund management companies who've wanted to list their funds as REITs, and in fact one case they wanted to list them overseas as well, so a cross-border listing. So we do get lots of requests, and we're very happy to engage with people about that. Worth mentioning that funding is via sponsorship from our industry partners, and we're very grateful to Real Foundations and RCA for initial sponsorship here. And if you'd like to keep in touch with what's going on here, I would ask you to sign up to the mailing list on the website for the CAS Real Estate Research Centre. Then you'll see the future events that we have going on. So that's the advert over, and that's the reason why we're here. Today's agenda, what we're going to do is have the report presented by Rachel in a couple of seconds, and then we're going to have a panel session. And we've actually picked the panel, so we have quite an integrated approach. We have an administrator, a lawyer, and a fund provider, and we encourage you to submit questions, and then we'll have concluding remarks, and that's how they all look. I don't know, I looked at that and I thought, is it me or are the panelists getting younger? And I think the answer to that is it's probably me. But what I would ask you to do, Ed is very keen that we have a technological aspect to this. So in my hand I have what I believe is called an iPad. And if you'd like to ask a question, we could go down the old-fashioned route that you put your hand up or shout out a question, or you could go on to a thing called slido.com, and there's the reference. If anybody doesn't have the Wi-Fi code, I have it here, or we could go analog and just you can ask a question. So either will do, and we'll take all your questions, and I'll be able to see those questions that you log through Slido as we go forward. So enough from me. I'd now like to hand over to Rachel, who's going to present the meat of the presentation, and then we'll go on to the panel session. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex, for the introduction. I'd now like to take you through the main findings of the fund structure paper. To ascertain the current trends of the real estate fund structures, interviews were undertaken with 22 industry professionals with current experience of fund structuring. In addition, to garner further information, an online survey was sent out to all AREF members, and representatives of 35 distinct firms responded. The interviews took place between mid-November and early January, and the survey was open between mid-October and mid-December. The key themes of the paper are split into two, the UK and Europe, and this is where the funds are domiciled, the assets in the fund are domiciled. It is important to emphasise that this paper is based on the contributors' opinions, so it's not a definitive picture of the real estate fund structuring market today. In addition, it should be noted that some of the issues that have been discussed are not yet resolved, they're ongoing. So therefore, the opinions may alter in the future depending on how these are resolved. However, I hope that you will find that this report provides a useful snapshot into the current trends today. So starting with the UK. To gauge which structures are most commonly utilised for UK funds in the past 3 years, interviewees were asked to identify the most prominent structures from their experience. Both open and closed-ended funds were considered. For open-ended structures, JPUTs were the most prominent, with PAIFs closely following. This was supported by the survey results. For closed-ended vehicles, English limited partnerships were by far the most overwhelming popular choice. Looking forward, there was a general consensus among interviewees that in the next year there will be little change in the most popular structures. PAIFs and JPUTs will continue to be popular, and English limited partnerships as well for the closed-ended space. However, there was a dichotomy of opinion about the future of JPUTs beyond the next year. The capital gains tax relief looks to be satisfactorily resolved to the great relief of the industry, and there were positive comments about JPUTs, still having a place in the fund structure market, offering flexibility, ease of establishment, and an experienced administration base in Jersey. However, its prominence was questioned. Jersey's not in the EU and hence is unable to market through AIFMD. In addition, there were considerable comments about reputational issues surrounding the treatment of tax. A number of interviewees observed that Jersey may suffer from the perception by some of being a tax haven. While capital raising has been challenging for REITs in recent times, there is now expectation that this structure going forward will become more prevalent, particularly offering alternative to some of the open-ended vehicles. Another structure that may become more commonplace is the ACS, which will provide a tax transparent option. It was first established in 2013, but there are few real estate examples so far. Familiarity and cost of establishment are two issues that are constraining its adoption at present. Following the EU referendum results in 2016, several open-ended real estate funds were forced to suspend redemptions, given the high level of investor withdrawals. These developments made headline news at the time, and hence interviewees were asked about their impact on fund structures. There is agreement that there has been no structural changes as a result of these developments. However, for institutional vehicles, amendments have been made to fund terms, particularly around redemption policies and mechanisms. The objective is to provide the fund manager with greater flexibility to deal with shock events such as the referendum result, and to protect the fund for remaining investors. Institutional investors are also pursuing greater governance, transparency and oversight of these vehicles that they are invested in. For retail products, it was noted that there is yet to be any fundamental change in terms. The FCA is currently in consultation with the industry and has stated that there will not be a major overhaul to funds, but want to consider what lessons can be learnt from what happened after the referendum to provide greater clarity to retail investors. In discussing these events, how these events may influence future fund choices, this is where REITs were often mentioned as a future alternative to open-ended vehicles. Cannot not talk about Brexit, but there is obviously a challenge in gauging the effect of Brexit on the real estate market, particularly in the UK, given the current level of uncertainty. Brexit has not yet had a significant impact on UK structures, as the majority of those involved are adopting a wait-and-see attitude. Some have acted, resulting in some recent movement overseas to Luxembourg and to a lesser extent Dublin. However, depending on the final outcome, the potential effect of Brexit on UK funds is likely to be more significant. In the survey, the vast majority of respondents stated that Brexit will be the greatest challenge to UK funds over the next 3 years. It was observed that UK managers still prefer to be domiciled in the UK or the Channel Islands if a fund is composed of UK assets and a largely UK investor base is targeted. However, if managers want to attract EU investors, they will need to consider jurisdiction very carefully. To what extent funds may move overseas will depend on whether access is still retained to the single market by UK financial services. The longer the indecision goes on for, the likelihood more fund managers may move to the EU to gain the certainty they require. Luxembourg is expected to be a key beneficiary of this, backed up by the survey results. These are shown on screen. Luxembourg was ranked joint first with England as the most prominent jurisdiction for UK funds in the next 3 years, while Jersey was third. In addition, several interviewees mentioned that parallel structures may become more common as a way of providing flexibility around investor domiciles. The influence of investor domicile is not just a UK issue. When contemplating the fund structure and jurisdiction, consideration of the domicile of potential investors is now more important than ever. One interviewee explained that historically investor domicile was a nice to know rather than essential information. However, today it was observed that there is a need to keep flexibility to be able to attract the widest range of investors. So, moving on to European trends. Again, interviewees were asked to consider in their experience what is the most prominent structure in the last 3 years for both open and closed-ended vehicles. For open-ended vehicles, the Luxembourg Limited Partnership, the SCSP, was most favoured, closely followed by the FCP. For the SCSP was also identified as the most common closed-ended structure. It was first introduced in 2013 at the same time as the implementation of AIFMD, to encourage alternative funds to locate to Luxembourg. Being a limited partnership, the structure is already familiar with investors and is straightforward to establish. Going forward, the message is clear from interviews that there is little change expected in the preferred European structures in the near future. It was very clear from the interviews and from the survey that Luxembourg is the domicile of choice for European funds. It has been very good at listening and adapting to the demands of the industry and has benefited from significant political support. The introduction of the SCSP is a good example. The introduction of AREF has also helped to support Luxembourg's dominance, to build, as one interviewee nicely put it, Luxembourg Inc. As well as its wide range of structures, Luxembourg is also able to offer significant infrastructure to support real estate funds. The physical infrastructure is straightforward to build, and the technology, the up-to-date technology, is in place. However, there were mixed comments concerning Luxembourg's workforce. Due to the great demand for staff, it is a very competitive market and there is considerable fluidity. Concern was expressed from several contributors about attracting the necessary staff to manage the burgeoning demands of the fund structuring industry. However, one explained that the workforce required for back-office staff functions is not location sensitive as in other parts of the fund management business, and so far staff have been attracted from countries bordering Luxembourg and also from Eastern Europe. Some functions have also been outsourced. One interviewee commented on the expense of establishing a fund in Luxembourg. However, another explained that Luxembourg has again adapted to support those who cannot afford to establish full fund management business in the country by providing a range of fund managers to hire who will provide the risk and portfolio management which is required through AREF. Another indication of Luxembourg's flexibility is its array of regulatory regimes. The newest, the AREF, was introduced in 2016 to provide an alternative to the already established SIF and SICAR regimes, and it was frequently mentioned positively in interviews. Under the regime, funds are not subjected to supervision by the Luxembourg Supervisory Authority, as the fund manager rather than the fund is authorised. It was described as regulatory light by one interviewee. The establishment process is therefore less complex and the fund is quicker to market, which will definitely suit certain types of fund vehicles, for example, those that are looking to benefit from short-term cycles in the market. Are there other jurisdictions that could loosen Luxembourg's grip on the real estate fund industry? From discussions, it seems unlikely at the moment. While Dublin has a large industry, it is evident that it has not experienced anywhere near the uplift in real estate funds that Luxembourg has. It seems this is due to the lack of a workable, unregulated product and a possible reluctance by investors and fund managers to be the first mover. There were some positive comments. One interviewee stated that they'd found the Irish regulator easier to deal with than the Luxembourg's CSSF. Several interviewees mentioned that there had been a move to reform the Irish limited partnership to create a more flexible structure. However, as there is also political consideration with this reformation, this is yet to happen. Two interviewees also mentioned the future prospect of France becoming a potential home for European funds, with employment laws being changed and regulations being relaxed to provide a more accommodating environment. In the future, the treatment of tax will remain a dominant force in deciding the structure of a fund, not just in Europe, but in the UK too. We've already experienced a hesitation caused by the UK government's announcement to eliminate capital gains tax relief for overseas investors. The OECD's Base Erosion and Profit Shifting Initiative, better known as BEPS, has also resulted in a review of structuring, particularly relating to pan-European funds. It came into force in July 2018 to tackle tax avoidance strategies that exploit gaps in rules to artificially shift profits to low or low tax environments. It is clear from the interviews that BEPS is encouraging holding vehicles to be domiciled in the same jurisdiction as the overarching fund structure. Due to the increased subsidence rules, Fund managers need to carefully consider mingling jurisdictions within their fund structures without good commercial reason. In the past, a fund may have had holding structures in different jurisdictions for tax efficiency purposes. However, having substance on the ground is now a more important driver in terms of structuring than squeezing out every drop of tax efficiency. There is the added benefit in cost efficiency, utilising the same people to provide substance for both fund and holding structures. These developments have benefited Luxembourg again, as many structures are already located there. So that concludes the main report of the main findings of the report. The full report here is available to you at the end of the seminar, and it also includes a high-level summary of a number of common UK and European funds. Now I'd like to pass back to Alex for the panel session.
Thank you very much indeed, Rachel. I'd invite the panel members up, and so they're not blinded by the light, they can hear. And what I would suggest is, just to start off, if people could just introduce themselves. You know who Rachel is, clearly, but if Richard, Jonathan and Ben can just introduce themselves and explain how they fit into the structure very briefly. I'm sure most people know them, and any particular trends that are affecting your side of the business at the moment. So maybe Richard, if I start with you.
Sure. So I'm Richard Batcher. I'm a partner at Evershed Sutherland, so I'm a lawyer. I spend most of my time helping clients to structure their real estate funds across a range of jurisdictions, so the UK, Luxembourg, Dublin, Jersey as well. I do both open-ended and closed-ended funds, less in the REIT space, but in all other structures. I think in terms of what Rachel has talked about this morning, a lot of that resonates with me, particularly around the jurisdictions, definitely seeing Luxembourg coming to the forefront, a lot of interest in the AREF from our perspective, and also with the SCSP, but we still have clients doing the FCP, particularly depending on the investor base and where they're located. I think also the UK is very interesting. I think it'll be interesting to see, and maybe we can talk about it some more if there's time, but it'll be interesting, I think, to see where the UK goes from here. I think there was general disappointment probably with the inherently illiquid assets paper and consultation from the FCA, but there are other initiatives going on that we can talk about, both from central government and now feeding through into FCA policy. And I think the debate around open-ended funds for real estate will be interesting, and the FT article this morning about the outflows of capital from the open-ended real estate funds over December and January also will bring that debate back to the fore, I think.
Very good. And would you like to?
Yeah, so Ben Marden, I'm the European Head of Real Assets for Citco Fund Services, so working on the administration side. I've actually spent the first 16 years of my life on the investment side, structuring funds, so I've got probably a unique position where I've seen both the building of funds, investing indirectly in fund of funds, but then also now on the servicing side, servicing funds across the European environment. So from my perspective, the environment we sit in today, there's an increasing need to be flexible in the services we offer. So we've seen a lot of people, particularly over the last 2 years post-Brexit, focusing more and more on Luxembourg. We've seen huge growth in Luxembourg, faced with the ever-growing challenge of skilled resource within Luxembourg. And that's a big factor in how, from our perspective, we continue to provide services. So, I mean, Rachel touched on how do you do that, attracting talent from other regions. You have to work a lot with recruitment agents, which obviously comes at a cost, but also then other ways of servicing them. Do you use other lower cost locations, other locations to provide services, but on ensuring, as always, with all offshore fund structures, substance remains critical. So it's understanding the regulation, working closely with lawyers, with the fund managers to say, okay, what's critical that we keep within the location to ensure the integrity of the structure. And I think that's something we'll continue to see, particularly with the regimes that use either the Jersey structures or the Luxembourg structures or potentially other sort of perceived tax havens is the phrase that's often thrown up by the media, not something we would use on the fund side, but actually how we continue to use those structures going forwards is going to be critical, or whether we see, particularly for the UK, more and more people onshoring. We're seeing obviously pay for age PAIFs now have been very, very popular. REITs are on the increase. ACS is definitely a hot topic. Still to be, I think once the first few funds get there, we'll see an uptake in them. As always, it's about first fund manager getting the funds off the ground. Others will then follow if they see the success. So again, it's an interesting time for us, but real estate continues to be a very hot area of investment when you look across all sectors. So it continues to grow.
Great, thank you very much. And Jonathan, would you?
My name is Jonathan Brady. I'm responsible for product structuring for BlackRock Real Assets, so real estate and infrastructure. I'm an Irish lawyer by background, so I've seen both sides of the spectrum. Many people's worst nightmare might be fund structuring, but I actually enjoy it a lot, so keen to get some conversation going in here today. I think in terms of trends, a lot of what we're seeing from our investors, maybe on the jurisdiction side, increasing resistance to what you refer to as tax havens, so maybe Cayman, BVI from European institutions, not even just at the fund level, but also at the downstream level of structuring of investments. So I think that's going to have an impact on both the structuring of investments and the structuring of funds. I think also from the non-European perspective, we're starting to see US and Asian investors more comfortable with investing in European products. So I think that can potentially be an advantage for the industry, for investors, for managers in creating more streamlined international funds, if everybody's happy to invest into an AIFMD vehicle such as a Luxembourg fund, a UK domiciled fund, or a Jersey fund. So from a jurisdiction perspective, I think we're seeing some trends towards Europe. On the strategy side, I think investors are seeking more diversification, more exposure globally to real estate as an asset class. So I think we might see an increase in global structures for real estate, which of course are going to be more complex, parallel fund structures, increasing master feeder structures. I think investor preferences as well are coming to the fore. Increased customization is something that we see consistently from investors. Issues like FX, currency-specific feeders, parallel funds in the currency of the investor. So particularly European investors, euro-denominated investors, if they're investing into a dollar-denominated product, are now sometimes seeking an additional vehicle which provides them with a currency solution as well. So, and there's a challenge there, obviously, for managers in managing scale with issues like that. I think on the product regulation side, back to Rachel's presentation, definitely some good innovations there in relation to the uptake of the RAFE regime, which was definitely a positive development from Luxembourg. I think also the development of unregulated products with the manager being an AIFM is a very flexible solution for investors. You're getting the AIFMD protection, but the fund itself remains flexible and perhaps less burdensome than something like the SIF regime in Luxembourg. So they're positive trends as well. I think maybe one of the biggest issues that I'm seeing at the moment, and would be interested if there's any tax practitioners in the room to get feedback today, is in relation to some of the big tax changes that we're seeing coming through. In particular, something that we're grappling with at the moment is the European Anti-Tax Avoidance Directive, ATAD, and ATAD 2, which is coming into effect on 1 January 2020 across Europe. In very simple terms, the impact of that directive is where you have a limited partnership structure, but you have investors in jurisdictions who don't see that limited partnership structure as tax transparent, you're going to create something or an issue under these anti-hybrid mismatch rules, which essentially will result in a disallowance of a tax deduction further down in your structure. So the consequence of that is that managers are going to have to create either more corporate funds where there's no debate about the tax transparency of the entity, or an increase in master feeder structures where you have a corporate feeding into a master limited partnership. There's also other ways of dealing with it in terms of financing companies, but they would need to be regulated funds generally as well. So I think that directive, whether that's reached the overall conscience yet, is going to have a big impact over the next year and have an impact on how we have to restructure a lot of our products.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And Rachel, I think there are two things that I got in particular from your report. One was the sort of the dominance of Luxembourg going forward, which I think we can touch on in a second. But the second, which got me particularly excited because my background is in the listed sector, was the term REITs, which always strikes a certain frisson. So I think just looking at that, what's interesting is that we saw that period where open-ended funds did actually list as REITs, and I think 3 or 4 got through the window of opportunity, and I'm certainly aware of 2 to 4 more that didn't get through that window of opportunity, that's one area, open-ended funds just listing as REITs. The other area is actually, as people are probably aware, a lot of fund structures are now actually normal REITs, so be it a Tritax, big box or primary health properties. So a lot of investors in the listed market are happy with fund structures as such. And I guess the third element, which mentioned, is obviously changes to the UK tax law, whereas previously they've got rid of the requirements for the number of shareholders, etc. So a lot of club deals and JVs possibly becoming REITs with a view to listing later on. So that's all very positive, but I guess the question is that actually real, or is that just people thinking it might be a good idea at some stage in the future because of those trends? And I just wondered if anybody had actually seen any hard evidence of any particular types of people coming through, or whether it's just a little bit further away. To the extent that you're allowed to talk about your deal flow, Richard.
So I think from my perspective, and REITs isn't my sort of specialist area, but I think from my perspective there is a lot of interest. We certainly have a couple of JV REITs that are in the process of being structured, but I don't think that my feeling is that there isn't a wave coming through it.
That's the impression I get as well, that it's a sort of people think about it.
Yes.
As for those 3 reasons I mentioned, and certainly with regard to open-ended funds, it's another possibility. But the issue is you could have 150 open-ended funds, but the market only needs a certain finite number of listed REITs, as we're seeing by the valuations of REITs at the moment. I can see. And Jonathan, from your point of view, are you?
Well, I think we're going to need to see maybe something really concrete to drive people more towards REIT. I think you touched on some of the factors there. I wonder whether the UK change in CGT rules could be something that will have investors looking at REITs more going forward. I think obviously the clarification around the position for Jersey Trust has been helpful to protect the Jersey funds industry in that respect. So I think that's a balancing act. I think from our perspective, not generally as focused on the listed side, the same as Richard, but I think potentially some innovations in fund structures as we move forward, whereby you might have structures such as a partnership sitting above a REIT to create additional tax efficiency for investors. But I think some of the specific rules around REITs make them a less flexible product for institutional investors and maybe for broader distribution outside the UK.
That's the impression I get. And the other thing that really came through, Rachel, was very much the dominance of Luxembourg, despite a limited pool of labour, which I regard as expensive people to hire, etc. And I wondered, the question is, how much is that purely inertia because people trust Luxembourg, and you mentioned previously they're less keen now on some of the more exotic locations, and sort of why hasn't Dublin really taken off as much as it might have done when it would appear to an outsider such as myself such an obvious place to capture more business? And that's open to anyone.
Happy to maybe take that one. Yeah. Dublin being a jurisdiction close to my heart, so obviously a very strong funds domicile. Generally speaking, it was always intrigued me as to why maybe real estate products hadn't developed in the same way in Dublin. I think I tend to sort of emphasise on the positives of Luxembourg when you see why Dublin hasn't developed. I think Luxembourg developed as the market standard. The legacy was there, flexible legal and regulatory regime, strong tax architecture, both from the double tax treaty network and on the treatment of gains and income. So I think also strong service provider, sophistication developed there, cultural factors maybe such as its position in Europe, language even. So became maybe the market leading domicile, and investors obviously and managers, it's an easier choice for them, I think. And potentially, as Rachel mentioned in your paper, that first mover advantage for a real estate manager it's not something that maybe a lot of institutions want to be seen to do or take a risk on their distribution. I think Dublin certainly has a lot of the characteristics and features that could and should make it a positive jurisdiction for real estate funds. One topic that has maybe consistently been highlighted is the lack in the past of a workable limited partnership structure or a market standard limited partnership structure. And I know that the Irish funds industry and the Irish government have actually moved, as Rachel mentioned, to look to reform that by the introduction of a new regime, which I think is expected to come in this year, but going through the government legislation process. So perhaps the introduction of that new limited partnership regime may make managers look at Ireland I think particularly some of the challenges you're seeing in Luxembourg, the renegotiation of the France-Luxembourg double tax treaty, potentially some of the positives there are being eroded. So I think it's always good for investors and managers to have more choice when it comes to jurisdiction. So potentially we do see investors looking at it more closely.
I think to further on some of the points you touched there, I think particularly when you're launching a fund, investor is key about is going to be raising the sufficient capital. Investors are comfortable with Luxembourg. They've been investing in Luxembourg for quite a while now. Fund managers are happy in Luxembourg. The infrastructure's there. So it comes down to if it's not broken, why change it? And I think you're absolutely right when you say something like the tax regimes, which is a lot of reasons why Luxembourg is so attractive, as you see challenge from some of the investment markets. France, I mean, you can see Germany, particularly Germany, obviously loses a lot of tax because of the tax-efficient structures. You can see the challenges that could change the landscape, but in the current climate, I think actually, whilst everybody still continues to be happy with Luxembourg, it continues to work. I don't see a huge shift away from it. I think everything is set up. Luxembourg has been very clever in how it's moved and positioned itself. The old regulatory world used to be slow. CSF approval used to take 6, 9, potentially 12 months to get a fund approved, then have to go to the other regulators. SCSPs came along, and suddenly it's, hang on a moment, I'm getting the regulatory framework, but I'm not having to go through the pre-approval process. This is actually really quick. It's a sufficient way of running a fund. So people can raise capital quite quickly. Investors are happy with it, and ultimately, investors and investor sentiment is what drives location of funds, target fund, investment areas. Ultimately, without the underlying investors, the fund doesn't work. So
exactly, and just on that point, I think you mentioned earlier that actually with the sort of global distribution, which people are going for now, I was just wondering to what extent that has an impact on structuring and domicile. So you know, if you look at the investor pool, I know it's a little bit outside the scope because we're then looking at the demand side rather than the supply side. But to what extent is the investor demand changing the sort of fund structuring or domicile or
huge consideration. I mean, Jersey's attractive for UK, always has been, but actually France are not particularly keen on Jersey. German regulators, BaFin, don't particularly understand Jersey, even though it's pretty similar to Lux, but they understand Luxembourg. So it's that sort of perception is very much, and from a regulatory perspective, getting that ability to market and sell is a key driver.
Okay. Now, do we have any questions from the audience? They're starting to feed through on my little iPad, but I just wondered if we had any live questions from real people. Yes, John at the back.
Just picking up one of your comments about uncertainty related to Brexit. I mean, I think it is worth noting that the political agreement to the withdrawal agreement only even proposes limited day one equivalents for financial services. So we haven't even asked for access to the single market, and there's no realistic prospect, unless there's a dramatic change in the continuation of passporting. All an agreement does is gives you the transition period to relocate rather than having to do it before the 29th of March. So I think we need to be clear about what sort of access to the EU we're talking about, and the distinction between continuing to use private placement under basic equivalence rules and actually having access to the single market through the passporting regime, which, as far as, unless there's something really dramatic happens between now and the end of March, is gone.
I mean, I would agree with that, and I think just anecdotally, I'm working for 2 managers, one US, one UK, where a UK vehicle would be perfectly satisfactory, and actually, because of where we are in that context, they won't consider a UK vehicle, and they'd both probably go with a Luxembourg vehicle for that reason. And actually, if we're talking about Jersey and the fact that Jersey doesn't get the European passport, I think it is important, as John says, that going forward, the UK may not have the European passport, depending on what happens. So I think that uncertainty, as John says, is definitely coming through, particularly at the moment.
I would fully echo.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think while that uncertainty prevails, just as you said, managers, investors, nobody's going to want to take the risk when there's a very viable alternative elsewhere in Europe.
And that's certainly been supported by the results we've seen with the results of
Yes.
where they see for the UK. I think it was 10 of the panel we interviewed that actually said they saw Luxembourg as a likely fund structure for UK investments. So,
Because it's easy to get to investors and it doesn't raise a red flag and they can get it through. Any other questions from the audience? Yes.
Nick Brown, Rajiv. Just wondering to what extent you think the views on Luxembourg may be coloured by the upcoming renegotiation of the UK Lux tax treaty?
Well, I think, I mean, I'm aware of that is in the works, the renegotiation. So I think certainly that's going to be a big consideration for managers that are looking to invest into the UK. And I think alongside the CGT rules change as well, which I think has created some uncertainty for Luxembourg limited partnerships looking to invest into the UK as well. I don't think there's been clarity there in the same way that there has been clarity for Jersey Unit Trust, for example. So I think all of those dynamics are definitely going to come into the conscious as we look at funds that are being established this year, and definitely could have an impact for managers that are considering investing into the UK. And maybe that's where some of these other jurisdictions that we've touched on start to get looked at more seriously then, if Luxembourg starts to have some obvious disadvantages that weren't there in the past.
Okay. Any other questions from the audience? Is everybody moving to Luxembourg by the looks of it? Everybody's moving, or starting out a REIT. I guess in terms of sort of future trends, we have a question here which I think we've answered, but correct me if I'm wrong, which talks about will tax avoidance legislation affect partnerships going forwards? But I think you covered that off. If you'd like to just elaborate just finally.
No, so yeah, absolutely. So I think for me, it's the anti-tax avoidance directive that ATAD 1 actually came into force in Luxembourg at 1 January this year. ATAD 2 is perhaps the more far-reaching regime that will come into force from 1 January 2020. And I definitely think that that's going to have an impact on limited partnership vehicles, because for the reason I mentioned about this, what is referred to as anti-hybrid mismatches. So where the vehicle in its jurisdiction is considered a tax transparent entity, such as a Luxembourg SCSP, but investors in the Netherlands, France and Italy, it's not clear cut that they view Luxembourg SCSPs as tax transparent entities. They potentially view them as opaque. So the issue you have then is that can create a tax deductibility disallowance in your fund structure for all your investors in the fund. So the ways to address that are either don't use a limited partnership, it's not Luxembourg specific, use a corporate vehicle, or potentially create a master feeder vehicle. There's also alternatives in terms of the downstream. You can insert potentially a corporate entity in between your partnership and your holding company, which could also solve some of those challenges. But I think the way I see it anyway, that's definitely going to be a key consideration over the next period. And maybe the important thing to mention around the ATAD legislation, which I think is good for all the industry professionals here to be thinking about, is this legislation wasn't brought in with funds in mind. It was more large corporations. So it's almost been an unintended negative consequence, I would say, for the funds industry in terms of how we think about structuring, which will create more costs for investors.
Okay. Yes. Oh.
Alex, it's Melville Reed.
Yep.
Looking positively to the future.
Yes.
And how we as an industry, particularly in the UK mainland, can find solutions. Isn't it now appropriate that, given the consequences for capital gains, the offshore vehicles, and in particular the JPOs, that in the arena of closed-ended funds, akin to a JPO, akin to an FCP, we as an industry should now be campaigning for a closed-ended tax-transparent vehicle, which would attract non-retail type investors and often onshore prototype, which could then be a more sustainable way of structuring these funds via the mainland UK.
So are you not arguing, therefore, Mel, for effectively a private REIT as per the US structure? And I guess my second question is, is that not where the legislation is broadly going? And I'm not the tax expert, perhaps John or somebody else, you could tell me. But I thought that's broadly where the legislation was going, such that JVs and club deals could now be structured as a UK REIT, subject to obtaining a listing within 3 years, or is that?
Well, this is a focus more in the unlisted space.
Right.
So yes, one can use descriptions like private REIT.
Right.
But effectively, it seems to me that post-Brexit,
Yes.
we need to be constructive in our industry dialogue with government in finding solutions, onshore mainland UK solutions, and in particular be able to service institutional pension money via a closed-ended, tax-transparent solution.
Okay, very good. Thoughts?
Shall I start? So I mean, I would agree with that, and I think it's been a long-standing issue in the UK that if you're looking at vehicles other than the open-ended, if we put REITs to one side for the moment, if you're looking at vehicles other than the regulated open-ended vehicles, there's actually been very little development for a long time, and we've got the limited partnership, but it's not ideal. It has its issues, and as soon as you add any sense of open-ended features to that, even if it's essentially a closed-ended vehicle but has some elements of being open-ended, it becomes problematic. And I think that's one of the reasons why people, I think, generally were reasonably disappointed with the FCA's consultation on inherently illiquid assets following the Brexit vote and the suspensions for the open-ended real estate funds. And I think there is an opportunity. I agree there is an opportunity there. The opportunity has been there, but it's now perhaps more critical because of what's happening politically. I think it's interesting. I think, to look and see whether there is a policy shift, and I think there is potentially a policy shift. So, the patient capital review that the UK government has been undertaking, and Treasury's Asset Management Task Force, which is looking at a long-term asset fund, is all potentially driving us in the direction of breaking down some of the barriers in the UK vehicles to being able to have long-term assets and less liquidity. I think the way that that's flowing through to the FCA at the moment is its consultation around permitted links for life insurers to allow them to have more illiquid assets within the fund. And that's predominantly focused on infrastructure, but it has an impact on all real estate as well, because the sort of 10% bucket is now 50%, or would, if the consultation comes in, be 50% overall. So it will allow life insurers under the permitted links rules to invest more into illiquid assets when previously they were pretty much in daily dealt funds, or predominantly in daily dealt funds. And linked to that, there's the FCA's discussion paper around whether the existing regulated funds in the UK are acting as a barrier to entry to long-term investments. And in particular, they're looking at the NERS and the QIS, the two regimes that could be used for property, and trying to identify whether those regimes are barriers to entry. And I think it's clear that in some scenarios they are, and they're looking at the discussion paper. I think that the angle that the FCA, I think, is probably coming from is more adjusting those regimes to enable long-term assets to go into those types of vehicles, probably, rather than creating some other unregulated vehicle. But obviously it's a discussion paper and there's a lot more to come. But I think it does show that there is appetite within central government, which is pushing the FCA to change its policy. And we are seeing that, anecdotally, we're seeing that on an individual level where we're getting better liquidity provisions from the FCA through discussions with them particularly for the QIS regime. And I don't think we can ignore the asset class underlying it. So there's a lot of build to rent, PRS, etc. in the market at the moment where because there's no stock in the market, people will have to build it first, develop it out before they have stabilised income producing stock. And the FCA is open, or has been open, to having lock-up periods within the QIS regime, which is something that they haven't go back 18 months, 2 years, that's something that they wouldn't have entertained before. And so there is this shift. I think the question is how far it's going to go and what it's going to look like.
And I've got a question here on modern technology, talking about the permitted link, maybe wider, but what about platforms which require daily dealing? And that's obviously an issue, which is why some people have gone down the route for a closed-end vehicle for that equivalence. But any thoughts about, I mean, and we did a paper with the IPF about pension funds and daily dealing. And the reality is it's daily pricing, not daily dealing that's required. Any thoughts around that?
Well, my own thought is if people really want daily dealing, there is a mismatch between the underlying asset and what investors want.
Yeah. Okay. Does that answer your question? And I guess the one I'd throw back at you is, what do you think is the correct industry body to collate all those views and present a coherent argument to government?
Well, in answer to these kind of 2 points, first I agree with the point you made. Putting it simply, it strikes me we've got a solution for open-ended in terms of PAVs and ACSs. What we need to do is just look across to the closed-ended arena and an onshore solution. And then the second part of your question is yes, industry, including AREF and other industry bodies, to really start to focus on it, aligned with the various FCA consultations, and create a strategic approach which really puts these together. Part of the challenge at the moment is an element of these FCA consultations are rather piecemeal, and they're looking at solutions in different arenas. We as the industry have this wonderful opportunity to really try to be more holistic and put together a kind of robust solution which may work both open-ended and closed-ended.
Okay, that's very interesting.
And would you be preferring then a regulated closed-ended vehicle? Is that your suggestion would be a more regulated product offered in the closed-ended space?
Well, in the closed-ended space, and we're brainstorming, and I welcome the debate, and I think we as an industry and within AREF should continue this debate, is not necessarily in this grey world of regulated, everything is damn regulated at the moment. Effectively, we're looking more in the less regulated space.
Yes.
A prototype, as I indicated to JPUT and FCP, but offshore and operating within the UK, and in particular servicing non-retail equity.
And I'm wondering whether the reforms to the English Limited Partnership are helpful in that respect. I haven't worked closely with that vehicle, but I am aware that the English Limited Partnership vehicle was reformed in the recent time.
The limited partnership, as we know, is connected with SDLT and trading and the tax treatment when you try to fling partnership interest, and the kind of other challenges as well. So let's not try to contrive solutions. Let's be robust and find holistic solutions, in part to the FCA consultations, which should be welcomed, and see this as an opportunity for a positive contribution to these debates, particularly in light of the challenges presented by Brexit.
So I think that the limited partnership reform that you're referring to has helped from a legal restructuring perspective, but what it hasn't done is to help the tax issues that would arise with using one in certain circumstances. I think the big policy question related to what you've just talked about is that all of the preferential tax treatment, etc., in recent times has been essentially provided to the regulated vehicles. So, the seeding relief, the ACS, the PAVE, etc. All of that has been provided. All of those reliefs have been given to the regulated vehicles, the ones that the FCA regulate and that the government is very comfortable with. I think policy question is, if you had a closed-ended vehicle that's unregulated, would they be so open to giving such a beneficial tax position to that type of vehicle, or would they only do it if it were a more of a closed-end vehicle but a regulated closed-ended vehicle? And I think that's a big policy question for the government.
Yes, John.
I mean, you could address that through tax regulations by having GDO
Yeah, I think that's definitely a relevant point, and it could be addressed either way. I think also the sort of comfort with the fact it's regulated, the governance, all of the rules around it, I think gives the government a lot of comfort that when they're giving the reliefs to a regulated vehicle, they feel comfortable with that. And I think there's a policy question around whether they give that to something that isn't subject to the rule book in the same way. But yeah, it could be achieved. Yeah.
Okay. Now I am conscious of time, and I know we started a bit late, but we have got one possibly final question which has come through, which sort of wraps it all up. And somebody's asked, given where we are in the cycle, has there been any slowdown in demand for new funds, which obviously looks at the demand side we talked about earlier? And I guess I would like to add on to that, has there been any noticeable change in terms of the style of fund required in terms of broadly diversified or specialist, or any trends in that side that you've seen?
So certainly from our side, and obviously given my position, I'm not going to mention any names or anything.
No.
Yes, I mean, we're still seeing a huge amount of funds trying to come to market. I mean, I think quite a diverse range, but particularly we're seeing more and more open-ended funds, which sort of says more of a people not necessarily looking at the opportunistic style investments right now. I think there's concerns around the amount of money chasing deals at the moment in certain jurisdictions. UK is almost, it's very unknown, so I think people are staying away. Germany seems to be very hot for investment, but lots of money chasing it. So things are getting to a point, it's the usual concern, are things getting too expensive again? But people are still trying to deploy capital. And with the open-ended funds now, actually the mechanics of open-ended funds now look like closed-ended funds. Money's not going in and sitting there as cash. It's being drawn down by vintage. So actually people over the last 10 years have changed open-ended fund structures to take the mechanics of a closed-ended fund structure to protect returns for existing investors while still having some of the flexibility.
So effectively it sits in a side pocket and it's not calculated in terms of your returns.
Exactly.
So it's not cash drag as such.
Exactly, yeah. So yeah, there is, although you've got less performance fees in open-ended funds, so the reasons for having that mechanics from a fund management perspective are slightly different, but you then have that sort of flexibility of drawing capital as required, but still having some of that gating, a more flexible gating that you don't see in PAVs and things like that, where you can say actually no redemptions for your first 3 years of investment, rather than having, say, 6 months over certain redemption limits. So there still seems to be a huge demand for real estate, and that's, I think, seen over the last, or since the financial crash, actually, with equities and bonds, particularly bonds looking less and less attractive, the yield on real estate is a big draw to real estate, and people are comfortable with alternatives. They look at particularly real estate as a good diversifier now, and a more commonplace in a balanced portfolio. It's not 2% anymore, it could be 10, it could be 15, possibly even up to 20%. And I think that's will continue to be the trend. So.
Very interesting. Well, on that very positive note, I'm aware that our hour is up. I'd like to thank you very much indeed for coming, and hope you've enjoyed your experience at Cass Business School, and to thank Rachel for her paper, which is available outside, and indeed the panel for their very insightful comments. So thank you very much.